Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the Human Risk podcast. On this episode, I'm returning to a subject that keeps coming up in my human risk research and work, and that's leadership. If we want to reduce human risk, then we need leaders that can inspire people to be their very best. And traditional models of leadership don't always do that. My guest, Siegfried Hoenle, has a PhD in psychology and has worked in various leadership development roles. What I find really interesting about Siggy's approach is that he's relentlessly positive and believes that leaders need to deliver their mission through 3 Ps: passion, purpose, and partnership. In our discussion, Siggy emphasizes the need for leaders to genuinely embody the values of their organization and create a community where people want to belong and flourish. He's no fan of the "you're lucky to work here" philosophy that many employers adopt. If organizations want to attract the best talent, then they need to offer compelling propositions, and that requires leaders that understand what their employees and prospective employees need and want. In the past, career progression was often looked at in the context of following rigid paths that, if we're honest, probably suited no one. But if we want people to have necessary skills to lead organizations in the 21st century and feel fulfilled, then we need to think a bit more fluidly. That's also really important if we want to develop more diverse and therefore effective workforces. Before we begin this episode, your regular reminder that my new book, Humanizing Rules, Bringing Behavioral Science to Ethics and Compliance, is available in all good bookstores, and you can find a link to that in the show notes. With all of that said, please enjoy, as I know you will, my discussion with Siegfried Hoenle on positive leadership. Siggy, welcome to the Human Risk podcast.
Thanks for having me, Christian. Glad to be here.
I'm really pleased that you're here. And look, you and I have worked together in the past and we know each other, but many of my listeners might not know who you are. So can you give them a little introduction to yourself?
Sure. My life is probably one that straddles academia and practice. So the real world, if you will, if we look at it professionally at least. And I started as a psychologist, studied psychology in Zurich, and then early on discovered that I wanted to work in organizations because that always interested me, how the dynamics of a group of people evolves that want to achieve a common goal. So that became, if you will, sort of the red thread throughout my career. After doing my PhD in Zurich, I started to work for the investment bank of UBS, Swiss bank, and then spent 3 years in London as well, which I very much enjoyed. And then I returned to Zurich and joined the other global Swiss bank, Credit Suisse, where I spent 17 years of my career in different roles. I ran leadership development. I helped to build the Asia campus in Singapore, so spent 2 years there, which was an amazing experience. And then, took on the different roles, ran the corporate university and ran talent management and diversity, recruitment. So a wide spectrum, always in the space that deals with how humans perform in organizations and, how you get people together and achieve a common goal that's set by the organization. And now I've started my own business, which I've ran for now 6 years in total, called Talent and Leadership Solutions, which gives me the opportunity to really, work across a wide spectrum of organizations and industries and help organizations establish cultures that enables them to deliver on their strategy, which I think is quite often overlooked, that you need the right culture in order to implement the strategy successful. And you also need to have the right capabilities, which is the second key focus. How do you enable people, individuals, but also teams and organizations to be able to execute on the plan. And I think that combination of capabilities and culture, I think, is the key to running a successful organization, also a healthy organization, something that is often overlooked. Many organizations focus on smart rather than on healthy. and that sort of helping us kind of to establish not only the firing power, if you will, but also a an environment where people can thrive is something that I feel there's always enough work to do, and so I'm very excited to now work across that wide spectrum of industries to help improve um, the work environment, which is important for organizations, but it's also important for each of us as human beings because we want to be uh, flourishing at work. We don't want to just go and get the paycheck, but we also want to, be ourselves and be the best version of ourselves, if you will, every day. That's what I see as my mission to help both organizations and individuals.
And I think this is really interesting because if I look at my human risk work, that's a very negative formulation. It basically says that people pose risk to organizations. In fact, I go as far as saying people are the largest risk facing organizations because whenever something goes wrong, there's always a human component. So people are always at the heart of things going wrong. There's always a human there. And we've seen that in banking as a good example. But you're looking at the opposite end of the spectrum, which is how do we get the best out of people? How do we create environments where they can flourish and do good things and build successful long-term sustainable businesses? And so I think it's really interesting because often when we look at human risk and the opposite, which I call human reward, i.e. getting the best out of people, they're both interrelated. Because if you overdo the human risk piece, you miss opportunities to get the best out of people. Equally, if you just say to people, do whatever you want, you'll get crazy outcomes. And so I think you and I sort of sit next to each other looking at slightly different aspects, but it's all about how do we build an environment that will get the best out of people?
Yeah, I think that's very very well put, Christian. I think indeed it is. I think the same ecosystem we look at, but we look at it from two different perspectives. I think if you go in, and I think it's also kind of a very real dilemma that organizations today are dealing with. Kind of how should they approach, particularly that risk topic, that human risk topic. And I feel that the approach, and I think that's probably, at the source of why you created your company and your consultancy is that many organizations are getting that wrong by just looking at the organization as, a potential group of risk takers that will, as soon as you don't look in their direction, they will do the wrong thing. And that's why you have to put all the red tape in and the processes. And of course, all this red tape and all those processes and all those check the box exercises then send one message to employees, which is we don't trust you. And we know from behavioral psychology that if you go in with that negative view, that almost cynical view that people innately, want to do the wrong thing if you don't control them, then you actually trigger that very behavior. You actually, if people are not trusted to want to do the right thing, they actually, in the end, show the behaviors that, we originally assumed they would have with our cynical worldview. It goes way back to Gregor theories, X and Y, which is, the theory X very much, driven by that negative view of the world and of human nature. And so we see that happening in organizations, that people are trying to find their way around the rules and regulations that have been set because they feel that, this is what is assumed they would do anyway. And they feel constrained by all the bureaucracy built around them. And so that's, I think, where many organizations are getting it wrong. Particularly, maybe that's a whole, other subject, particularly if they get mixed messages from the top. That if they're expected to drive the best next quarter of the century, then their only way to do that is very often to find a way around the policies that constrain their risk taking. And so I think we see that very often in organizations, that from the one side, you put those frameworks around them that constrain their doing, but on the other hand, they're expected to deliver highest returns within the short term, which is then creating the issues that we have often been seeing in organizations, particularly in recent times.
And I love that articulation because I think you're right. It's kind of, I'm going to present you with an impossible challenge, right? Which is make loads of money and comply with all
Yes.
these rules.
Yes.
And if you don't do that, you're going to lose your job. Is this the ultimate risk? So there's almost two extremities, right? It's high reward if you do well. It's lose your job if you don't.
Yeah.
And then here's the game that we want you to play.
Yeah.
And of course, as you point out, if there's sort of those competing objectives, you go, well, how do I solve this problem? And I think what's interesting is kind of organizations, if you start to look at that and you say, well, if you thought about it like a computer game, then you'd recognize what players in that game will do, right? Which is they'll follow the incentives that
Yeah.
are put in front of them. And so I like to think a lot around sort of saying, well, actually, we just need to your point, is to think about what is this like for the people going through it? And what are the things that are going to influence their behavior? And let's start to impact
Mm.
those, and let's start to drive those and build structures and incentives and cultures that deliver what we want to deliver.
Um,
And as you say, human beings will respond to what's put in front of them because we're very good at being responsive to the environment.
yes. Yeah. Yeah. And I think the sort of starting position should not be the cynical position that we have to assume the worst. And that's why kind of I'm interested in positive psychology, which looks at kind of that alternative perspective of McGregor, the theory why, if you will, that assumes that human beings have an incredible potential to do the right thing and to do good, actually. But, of course, it doesn't end there, So as you said before, we cannot just create an organization and don't put any frameworks and rules around it. So I think probably the right recipe is to start with that positive assumption about human nature, but then to put the checks and balances in that are required to run a responsible business, which is sort of, I would say, not cynicism, but skepticism, if you will, is the right approach to have if you're responsible for an organization. But I think the ingoing position to say kind of how can we create an environment that allows people to bring out their best rather their worst, I would say is what we have leaders for, right? That's a leader's preeminent task, to actually set that environment that allows good behaviors to show, and that keeps bad behaviors in check. And I think positive psychology, and that's why kind of I run a both a program, but also I'm writing a book about the translation of positive psychology into the leadership context. So which I call positive leadership, and that's it's been fascinating for me for the last 10 years. I'm a visiting professor at IE Business School in Madrid, I've been teaching it there to thousands of executives in the meantime, and the response that I'm getting is very encouraging, because people innately kind of want to uh, flourish in what they're doing themselves, but also then are more ready once they have discovered kind of what is the code that, or if you will, the happiness equation to follow in order to find that fulfillment at work. They also are more ready as leaders to create an environment so that others can basically find that same fulfillment by tapping into the sources of happiness that we often just allocate in our private life. And then, we go to work in order to earn money, but that is obviously a very short-sighted view, and we spend so much time of our lifetime at work that it would be a sin not to think about what makes us happy there. In particular, because we know that the connection between happiness and success and achieving our goals is not one where, if we're successful, if we reach our goals and if we make a lot of money, that makes us happy. It's actually the other way around. So we know from a huge meta-analysis that happiness precedes success. And so if you're happy at what you're doing, the likelihood that you will be able to monetize that is huge, right? So it's far higher than if you just pursue making big gains, on the financial side without putting that on the basis of, flourishing at what you're doing.
There's a really interesting thing there that we are, I think, starting to see more discussion about is this idea of bringing yourself to work and delineate, and particularly through the pandemic, we've seen this delineation. Certainly for people in the knowledge, people with jobs with keyboards, right, that don't necessarily require them to be in a specific location, where the blurring of sort of personal life and business life has increased. And so people's awareness of how do I feel about my job and is this something I want to be doing? My senses has been increasing in recent years. And so I think when you talk about a sense of happiness and satisfaction, lots of bad things have happened in the past few years. But if there's one dynamic that I think is interesting is it's that. And this, we look at the great resignation and all these sorts of topics. It seems to me that what you're pointing towards around that sense of purpose and that sense of interest. And if going to work to pick up a check, fine. If there's only one employer in your town, and we're back a few centuries ago and you had to go and work in the coal mine or you had to work for the factory, then you had no choice. But nowadays, particularly in the digital world, people have more options. You can work for companies that aren't in the same location as you. And so I think this is becoming much more prevalent. And so I'm fascinated by what you're talking about and saying that not only is that a gut instinct that we want to be happy, but there's also evidence behind it that says this is a key driver of success.
Yes, very, very much so. And I think you're absolutely right. The circumstances that we have lived through over the last 2 years, I think has given people the time, or if you will, the disruption that was required to think about, what it really is that makes them fulfilled, and just to come out of that extreme situation that we have lived through the pandemic, and go back into what they had before is something that intuitively many don't want to do, which sort of leads to now this phenomenon that we call the kind of great resignation, or kind of, you know, people are reluctant to just go back into what some of them have experienced as the mill, that they're in, and that is just necessary in order to finance their lives, but want to actually, have kicked the tires of that and now are pursuing different roads that enables them to both kind of earn a living, but also do it in a way that, taps in some of those sources of happiness, which is kind of not that intuitive, because sometimes when I start to talk about happiness, people have this reaction of saying, "Woo, woo," this is now getting into sort of the territory of just focusing on the gratifications that we want to enjoy, and doesn't have anything to do with real life. And so let's not talk about it. And of course that ignores the biggest part of the research of positive psychology, which has uncovered sources of happiness that are highly relevant for the work context, and that is where it's very worthwhile exploring.
But what's interesting in that is there's an implicit presumption that happiness is a it's hedonic, it's a person, it doesn't belong in the workplace, right? And therefore you have to sacrifice something to go to work. And work can't be fun. Work is serious. And then you can do your other thing, because this idea of chasing happiness feels a bit decadent. And that sort of has leisure written all over it. Things that you're passionate about, your hobby, for example, well, that's different to work. And I think what you're talking about is saying, actually, we need to recognize that those things that we look for in our private lives are also things that we're going to look for at work. And so, yes, there's a delineation in terms of the things that, I'm not going to be able to have everything my own way at work in the way that I might be able to in my private life. But the drivers, the things I care about, those remain constant because guess what? It's the same person that's in a work environment. And so I think what you're starting to unpick is that dividing line and saying the priorities that exist in our private lives will also on some level exist in a work environment.
Correct. Absolutely. And I think it applies to both. I mean, if we look at something that Martin Seligman researched and developed, the sort of the happiness equation, then the ingredients of that, first of all, the result we are after, the happiness we're talking about, it's not the quick rush of endorphins. It's not kind of that thing that we experience, the mode we experience when we get a gratification. It is actually kind of more in the territory of life satisfaction. It's sort of when we have the realization that our life is really on the right track and things are coming together for us. And if that's what we want, then in order to get there, we have choices that we can make, and therefore it's also on us to get there and to make conscious decisions, both in our private lives but also in our work lives, that tap into the sources of happiness in that meaning. And the first one that I want to mention is actually that we are clear about where we get our psychological energy from. And you mentioned the word passion before. Where is the territory where we can live our passions, where we can invest energy and actually gain energy almost at the same strength. And so that's where we have to find kind of what makes us tick, where our strengths are, our personal strengths are, and because that will allow us to get into, and that's been around since the 70s, a concept that we call flow, a state of optimal performance, where we fully immersed in the task at hand, and and that is only possible if that task is sufficiently challenging to mobilize our skills. But we only find that if we're in tune with our passions, with our strengths that we bring to the table that are unique to us. And that zone of optimal performance is actually where we are so concentrated on what we're doing that we sort of lose a sense of time. We don't longer have to think about what the next step is going to be. Things are flowing, kind of hence the name flow, and we almost observe ourselves performing. In sports, it's been quite popular and it's been quite well researched, but also at work, it is key that we get into that zone where, and one fascinating thing about that is also that we lose a sense of time when we're there, because all the processing powers of our brains, the 110 bits per second processing power, is focused on the one task. So I think that's the first. We need to be in touch with what gives us energy and then apply that to an objective that is challenging. And I think that's kind of fits so well into the work context that it should be a zone we seek to be in as often as possible. The second is around purpose, and that's obviously a space that is very relevant to us as human beings. I don't think any other being on the planet is looking for purpose in what they're doing. It makes us human. We want to make sense of what we want, of what we're doing, and we want to discover meaning in our actions, and also meaning in the environment and what we are expected to do. And I think that's a very relevant factor as well. If we then look at how we handle human risk in organizations, because if we manage to connect every individual in an organization to a purpose, to an overarching purpose, why the organization is doing what they're doing, it is much more likely that it becomes clear to everyone in the organization what is right and what is wrong. Where do we leave the track of creating that purpose? And you know, for that, obviously, organizations need to know. why they do what they're doing besides making money. And it's quite often to create value for customers, but also to create value for society, for the environment. And that's I'm glad it's become much more of a topic, through the sustainability requirements that we're now seeing. But I don't think it has yet really gone to the core of what many CEOs and chairpersons worry about when they create their strategies. I think it's still a little bit externally driven, and organizations have to do a lot more work to really go deep and come up with the why of their organizations, because that creates an opportunity for employees then to connect their own why to the why of the organization. I think that's an extremely big opportunity that I see many organizations focusing on right now, but there's still a lot more work to do.
And I love that idea of almost a sort of visual image would be you put a flag in the ground, right, to say this is what we're
Mm.
about, or you have a statement of so something that people can identify with, and then they can bring their own, as you say, right. It's not that everybody grows up and what I'm after. There'll be a company that's got exactly what I'm looking for. It's how do I like. So there might be if you start your own company, but if you join an existing company, there may be some compromises there, but you can at least start to identify with it. And the bit I like about what you're talking about is you start to get to a world where you would say, actually, look, some organizations are not going to be right for certain individuals. And so the clearer the organization can be about what it stands for, if people don't want that for whatever reason, they can go and find somewhere else that does have it. And I think there's this interesting view of careers where people talk often about, careers for life. And so career management discussions and things are always focused on a view that individuals ought to be thinking about their careers as being within that organization. So you have an annual discussion, and it's unless you've got a very forward thinking manager, it's always about what's the next role or the challenge within the organization. And what I think is interesting about what you're talking about is it starts to get a much more mature discussion, which is there will be, in the same way you described your career, you've moved between organizations. Okay, it's within a sector, and you're now, but you've moved, and as an opportunity might not have existed in a particular organization, or you might want a different form of challenge. And so I think as we think about fluidity of careers and opportunities that people have to move, it's much easier to move companies in a digital world than it is in a physical world. I think that starts to get really interesting because you can then be much more honest about things. And we don't have to have this kind of idea that everybody's going to stick around forever. We can recognize that people may want to come in and be in part of the journey for a while and move around. And so we have it's much less rigid structure. And the only way you can have that fluidity is if you start to have a bit more clarity from companies about what they're about so that you can see, well, okay, this is how I fit in. So for me, for some people that's terrifying, right? But I think this is really exciting and interesting because it feels much more human to be much clearer about things and give people choices. And some of those choices might be to go somewhere else.
Yes. Yeah. And I think, you're absolutely right. I think the choice of organization is one that an individual should make on the basis of that question of purpose, at least partially on the basis of purpose, because purpose is so relevant whether we feel that we can flourish, whether we feel happy at what we're doing. If we feel that what we're doing is not creating a value that we care about as human beings, then you can have the best benefit framework. You can have a very nice salary, at the end of each month, but it will not actually make you intrinsically happy with, and you don't really feel aligned with yourself if the purpose of the organization you work for has no relevance to you, or even works against your own framework of purpose you want to give to your own life. So if you can't make the difference you want to make in the world, you know, in the job you're in the organization you're in, I think there's some soul searching to do. And to your point, there are many organizations out there And if you don't find any, then you can start your own, right? So I think it's really about creating that situation where you feel, okay, I'm on a mission that makes a difference in the world that I really want to stand for. And that's a very powerful part of what makes us happy as human beings.
And all of that brings us then to the leadership models that you need to make that happen.
Hmm.
And so I think one of the things that's interesting is that it's to your point is if you don't have somebody at the top being clear about what the organization stands for and living those values themselves and those things that these things will fail, right? Because we do look to those leadership pieces. And so as you were talking and as I was thinking about the shift in dynamics, what I think is interesting is it's not necessarily a shift in human desires. It's just we're being more honest about it. It's been made more clear to us. There are greater opportunities for us to pursue that because of partly because of technology, but also the awareness that we've had of things that are going on and social changes. We needed leaders that can really deliver on that. And so I think we're at a fascinating stage where, in many respects, you could say leadership responsibilities are changing, and there's greater ask for leaders to recognize these dynamics and be able to deliver them. And so you talk about positive leadership and some of the attributes that we look for. It's always been there in the same way that the desire to follow your passions has always been there as a human thing, but it's much more prevalent and required. And therefore, the sorts of skills that we need from leaders nowadays are probably shifting. And so I'm intrigued by your experiences of that and how you see leadership roles and the sorts of people that we need in those. I mean, there's a lot of change in that space, right?
Yes, there is change in terms of how it's being discussed, and I think there isn't a fundamental change in terms of what good leadership looks like. It's been articulated more and in a different way, maybe than in the past, where we talked about the charisma of a leader, kind of whether they are inspiring or not, and right now, I think we have seen and we have articulated that it's really important for leaders to stand for something, and to stand, in many cases, stand for something that goes beyond just for an organization making profits, and so there's a bigger expectations. To your earlier point, coming out of the pandemic, we have particularly seen that is no longer enough for talented individuals to choose an organization. They also want, if you will, to see that environment, or they want to work in an environment where they can be themselves, they can bring their strengths to work, where they can pursue a purpose they can identify with, and also an environment where they have a sense of community, where they feel they can belong and they can speak up, right? Which is the whole point of bringing your whole self to work, is that you can also be critical. You don't always have to speak the party line, and you're not shut down if you discover something that isn't going well. But in contrary, actually, you see the purpose of the organization, and you feel obliged to highlight when something is going wrong, because you're part of the workforce that is trying to fulfill that purpose of the organization. So if something comes in between, everyone should feel accountable to highlight that. But to your point, I mean, that only emerges when there are leaders at the top who cultivate that environment, and to impersonate in the first place, a set of values that is not only that they don't only articulate, but also then live kind of in the daily reality, and through that become credible in what messages they give to employees. I mean, it's a fact that if you're a leader, you are watched 24/7, about you, and every step you make and every step you don't make, everything you say and everything you don't say is actually interpreted by the people you lead. And therefore, that is the first task, I think, as a leader, is to have that reliability, that consistency, that credibility as a leader in terms of consistency between words and actions, which is also where it often and spectacularly falls down, as we know from many stories of fallen leaders. But it is one where I think you still, you have always been able to make a difference there as a leader if you're consistent, and if you also take a risk. I think if living your values in a corporate environment means taking a certain level of risk, it's much easier to change your own mind, with the different tides, in the organization. Kind of, if you get a new boss, if then your own values don't count anymore, that's the moment when you lose credibility. But you will probably be able to stay in your job, which is why so often we have more of a political approach at the top levels in organizations, than a one that we would call or associate with leadership. Because leadership is about, as you putting a stick into the ground and then standing to that, and also staying true to your values when the going gets tough.
And those skills that you talked about, the leader needs, just like having to really live these values. I mean, for some people, clearly they're not capable of doing that, right? And so we've seen, there's lots and lots of stories of leaders that have failed miserably. And we can pick political leaders, we can pick business leaders who failed at the task, just not been up to it. And I think one of the things that's interesting when you talk about these requirements is then the question of the sort of people that we put in leadership
Yeah.
positions. And I it's always struck me that some of the traditional processes that are there to select leaders, the skills that you need to get through those processes aren't necessarily equipping you well for those leadership roles. So if I took, a good example for me from always used to amuse me in banking, it was kind of, well, in order to give you, if you're in a trading role, in order to give you a larger book to be able to trade, i.e., more financial responsibility and risk taking, we need to promote you. And so very historically, often little thought was given to, is this person actually capable of fulfilling a more senior position? But I have to give them that because I can't let them trade larger sums if they're not at that more senior position. And so you could see processes where people that were very good at the day job were promoted into leadership positions without having some of these skills, who might be a great trader, for example, but terrible leader from a cultural perspective. And so it strikes me that we really need one, we need to give people skills to be able to do that. And your point around positive leadership, I think, is really, really powerful, interesting. Like, we need a model, we need to know what to do, we need to train people. But the second thing is we need to be selecting the right sort of people, make sure that we have processes that put the right raw materials, if you like, into those roles.
Yeah, very much so. I think that is kind of indeed where the work starts to articulate what it is that you you kind of what drives the expectation of a leader in an organization. I think is very much tied to the purpose of the organization. And if we promote people because they are able to make a lot of money as traders, um, then that's kind of, if you tie that back to the purpose of the organization, then probably kind of it's a reflection of us saying, or the CEO or the chairman saying, that the main purpose of that organization is to make as much money as possible. And if that's what we're expecting, and that's where it stops in terms of what we expect our leaders to bring or to perform, then we don't have to be surprised if we get, leaders with a very low spectrum of skills, or narrow spectrum of skills, that, don't do all of the other things that you need to do in order to have a healthy organization, that you have, talent that is, in filling the pipeline, for succession, for future leaders, where we, probably trigger some of the wrong behaviors that are against the health or even the ethics of an organization. So it's, if we say we want to be more than just a money machine as an organization, then we also have to really define what's important to us, and leadership has to be, you know, one part of that. We want leaders who impersonate the values of the organization, and who make sure that, our organization is there not only, across the next couple of quarters, but is healthy for the next for the next 5 to 10 years at least. And if we have that view, then of course, to your point, the selection of leaders has to be different. Yeah, the requirements that we have of leaders, are much broader, and therefore it can't be that we just promote the best practitioner to be a leader, because that goes wrong so many, more times than you are lucky, that this good practitioner also does have a leadership talent. Sometimes it works, but it's a little bit hazardous, in terms of approaching it. So that's what we do with our clients, is actually looking at that question of what is it really that the organization stands for. What do our leaders need to be able to do as a result from that? And then how do we describe that? How do we communicate that? And how do we bring it into the organization? And that very often, makes us develop um, different approaches to select leaders, to early identify leaders, to then develop them, to assess them, to make sure that they're ready before they, make the next step, and, take the next bigger responsibility. And where we do that, we also see that it contributes to the overall health and the long-term success of organizations.
And we sort of see things that we recognize as bullshit,
Yeah.
right? Claims that are just not true, whether that's a politician saying something, or company promising something that's too good, or somebody saying one thing and doing, right? We all intuitively understand that, and we sort of sniff that out. And the bit I find really interesting is if you take those same analytical skills, the sorts of skills I will use when I'm, looking to buy a product or deciding who I want to be friends with, or whatever, the basic human education thing. And then lots of times you see in companies where it's kind of, we care about, they make good to be seen to be saying, and you get senior people saying the right thing, but you can tell that it's not genuine. Somebody spouted a corporate line, and you just sit there, and that everybody in the room is thinking this is just BS,
Wow.
right? This is just not correct, right? We know this is nonsense, and you're just saying
Wow.
it, and you've just put value. You've made a value statement here, saying this is very. You say it's very important to us, but your actions do. And so we all intuitively understand this as a human being, which is why I think you're really onto something here, because it must, if it makes sense in the outside world, there's no reason why it wouldn't also make sense to us as humans in the business world. But it's taken quite some time for the shift to
Mm.
come of people starting to call this stuff out. There has been this kind of bluffing game of, yeah, we'll just, we'll pretend we care about the environment, but we'll continue trashing
Mm.
it over here. We'll pretend we care about equality, or we want people to speak up, but actually in reality, we don't. And so this disconnect between what you say and what you do, I feel like it's finally being unwound.
Yeah. I agree, and I think you put your finger on kind of a danger as well of kind of the whole ESG movement as well now, and the talks, as we talk about the environment, and 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 ethics, and kind of diversity in organizations as an obligation of a company. In fact, the big danger is now to just create more bullshit, that to talk about, and that is not followed by genuine action. And so the more concepts that we put in the middle and discuss, the more they always come with that danger of not being lived genuinely in organizations, but just talked about. And you're absolutely right. I mean, we see bullshit when there is bullshit, right? So we have this detector built in, and you know it's a catastrophe that it is that way. I think I mean, if you look at the Gallup studies that they regularly do, they we only have in Europe, we only have 14%, 1-4 engaged employees in organizations. And that's that's a really independent study. That's not kind of the internal engagement surveys that are run, where very often employees don't believe in the anonymity of the whole exercise, and therefore are more optimistic or more positive. But in the Gallup study, if if you think about just 14% engaged employees, how much value we leave on the table, and how much risk we expose our organizations to just by this cynicism that we cultivate in organizations through leadership that does not act on what they're saying. Um, which is one factor. I mean, there are other factors of disengagement, but cynicism is at its core. And I think there was another study a few years back that said, there's some 400 billion US dollars every year left on the table because of that corporate disengagement. That also now led to this widespread corporate resignation, and people now walking away from it rather than kind of just walking away from it mentally, but staying in their job. So we have, I think we now see a mobility that before has just happened in people's minds, but that was equally as bad. So now people are walking physically away from their jobs, while before they were only walking away from it psychologically. So I think it is a huge imperative for us to address this issue, and it can only be addressed through leadership. And I think that kind of if we study kind of what fundamentally gets us to flourish as human beings, and create an environment at work that allows for that, and then that is a big step to address this, and to kind of to create work environments that are built on passion, purpose, and on partnership. So creating communities where we want to belong. Then kind of that can get us out of the mess. So that's I guess that's why I'm writing on that book that has been in the making quite a while now.
But the first one is if we looked at that sort of go back to more primitive societies where tribes, you'd be looking there and you'd want a leader that you trusted who was working in the best interests of the tribe, right? That wasn't selfish and all those sorts of things. And if you looked at the tasks that people would be given, it would be proportionate to your skill set and what you could deliver, right? You'd be finding things for people to do that made the best use of their skills. So you'd find that the most athletic people would go out and do the hunting, right? And then you'd have the people that were most talented at design to make pretty things that you need, and so you'd find skills that got the best out of people. And so as you look at that sort of structure, I mean, it seems to me that we've kind of imposing that in the corporate world is we lost a whole load of those things. Well, we sort of had unsuitable leaders that you wouldn't, if there was any form of sort of meritocratic element to it, you wouldn't have ended up with, or even democratic element, right? You wouldn't have ended up with, and you've got people doing jobs that they're not entirely satisfied with or particularly good at, under duress in some case. And so I think it's interesting to what you're describing there is a very human world, where we start to say, how do we get the best out of people? How do we make sure we've got the right people in the right roles? How do we make sure that they're that they're enjoying not necessarily every moment, but there's a passion and an interest in what they're doing? We know from the outside world that delivers better results. And so I think this is a really, really interesting philosophy that says we need to, if we want to succeed, these are the things that we need to do. How do we do that? Well, we need better leadership. And hence you point to the model that you're highlighting, which is the solution has to come from the top. But it's coming back to a very natural thing, but come back to this basic humor of sort of humanizing organizations and recognizing that we need to be thinking more in those terms. And some of the theoretical structures that we've put in place, aren't fit for purpose. And we need to change those. And how do we change those through leadership?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, we can, if you really go back to the tribal society, I think there were, and how they functioned, I think they had fewer choices. Probably in those societies, we had fewer choices built in, and through civilization and the complexity of civilization, and also the sort of creation of standard of living that goes way beyond just securing food for the next day. We have certainly we have kind of a dilemma that kind of between short term needs and kind of long term health. That I think is getting in the way um, of that leadership we have just been spoken about. We have just been speaking about. Because if we, because I think that is at the root of much of kind of how we, at least with listed company, kind of the behavior we see in listed companies is very short term monetary focused, because we report on a quarterly basis. For example, kind of the tribes didn't have to report on a quarterly basis, right? Those that they, they had sort of the survival of the tribe was
Which is, it's almost like daily
yeah,
reporting.
exactly. So then kind of if you could secure kind of next day's survival, then the long term prospects for that tribe were also automatically you know greater than if you had less success with the gathering and the hunting. Um, that is different. Obviously, the complexity of a big organization really, poses the question to CEOs and C level in general. Shall we go for this short term benefit that will make us look good in front of investors, in the next quarterly reporting cycle, or shall we not go for it and show lower results and be criticized? But in 10 years, or in 5 years, we will have not taken on the risk that might harm the organization in that time frame, in that longer time frame, and or kind of are we making profits on the back of society, on kind of the wider society or the environment? Shall we do that or not? Is it the right thing to do or not? Kind of, and the answer to that is really, is really driven by the time frame that you're taking. Because if in the short term you can improve your results, then you will be praised as today, and who knows whether you're still around in 2 years as the CEO. So that's why we see kind of the incentives that our system gives the decision makers in organization um, are not conducive to having that long term view and having that kind of more that view that looks at kind of the long term health of an organization. And so if you look at organizations that have tried to change that, and then it's very interesting, kind of the to take yourself out of the quarterly reporting, for example, is can be a very helpful first step in order to drive a more purposeful agenda. And we have seen it with Unilever, right? With Paul Pullman, who has pursued that agenda with some success during his tenure. So there are some examples, but our overall system with for listed companies in particular, is not helpful.
You wanted an example of ability to think long term and demonstrate your true value. You could look at tech companies, and I'm thinking of the big ones. So if I looked at Facebook and the way the shareholding structure operates, right? Zuckerberg has control.
Mm.
And so he's able to make, so he makes his big call, changes the company's name to Meta, makes a massive call without really consulting anyone because he doesn't need to. And so I'm not sure I'm putting the values forward that he is demonstrating in his leadership, right? I think that company is responsible for lots of things that aren't good. But it's an interesting illustration. And you could say the same about Amazon. Bezos places lots of bets and he can make long term. Now, partly because it's now a big company and so they can afford to do that. But that structure, even though you've got quarterly reporting, it's outside that because of the shareholder thing. And I think, Apple, another interesting one where again, they make longer term bets because of the way that, you've got longer tenure of leadership and those sorts of things. But I think it is interesting. It's to your point that it's that short term thinking that's unhelpful. And so, yeah, it all does come from the top, and so I think all of that points to, the importance of those leadership positions and structures that allow them to do that. Of course, if you get the wrong people in and they're not subject to regular scrutiny, that's going to be a problem. But I think what is interesting, is in a way we're seeing much more transparency about what goes on inside companies. And so historically, we would have had, you know, leaders were the public pronouncements were there, but now employees are getting much more of a voice. And so we can not just see what companies are officially saying, but we get inside views, things like Glassdoor. We get, much more leaking because it's easier to leak nowadays than it ever has been before. So we're getting more transparency around what the company says externally and what it's doing internally. And so I think there's all these fascinating dynamics there that sort of point us in the direction of less places to hide now for senior leaders. You are accountable, you are responsible. And so the pressures are increased, but I see much more opportunity to sort of hold people to account possibly than ever before. And so quarterly reporting, I agree with you, is not, it leads to some bad short-term dynamics. But I think there are other countervailing forces that, as I say, people leaking things, employees being more willing to talk about what's going on, employees voting with their feet, customers able to vote with their feet. So there's some interesting pressures there that start again to I think shift the sorts of pressures that are on leaders and therefore the ways they need to respond to it, which all points us back to the model you were talking about.
Yeah, and I think interesting you're mentioning the leaking and the kind of employees harming their organizations by actually sharing information that they're not supposed to share, which is obviously also a key risk, a key human risk, uh, which also emerges from that cynicism people have developed with their organizations, where they feel they feel disengaged. They feel actually, Gallup has an own category for that. They feel these are the actively disengaged employees. So the other 86% that are not engaged are not just all switched off mentally, but some of them actually are actively disengaged. So they actually, these are the people who steal pencils or walk to the press and share confidential information, and that obviously, is is creating a lot of harm for organizations. And so the question is, how do you deal with that? And and what I've been, preaching about this dilemma is that, and what many organizations are still not really leveraging is the value of internal transparency, in fighting that unwanted external transparency. If you trust your employees enough that you share key information, key also financial data of the organization, then that is, a, logical that you would do that, because in today's information environment, there is no secret information anymore. You have to assume that every single piece of data there is about your organization is almost out in the open space anyway. And the first ones who should hear the information and should get the data is your own people, because these are the people that can constructively work with that data and probably also need the data in order to do a better job in what they're doing. But many organizations, hide this information from their own employees, and actually have them, even when kind of the big communication on the new strategy happens, the investor hears it before the own employees are being informed, because there is sort of a hidden assumption that, they have to go kind of with the flow anyway, because they get the paycheck at the end of the month. And that is so wrong, and it leaves so much value on the table, and it disengages employees uh, to an extent. I wouldn't say this is an apology for going out with information. I don't think it's, once you signed an employment contract, yeah, you also signed that you wouldn't do something like that. But it happened, right?
Right.
You actually triggering the wrong behavior. Um, and um, and I don't think there's enough creativity to go about this. That is, I mean, we see it in many organizations. I mean, those organizations that work with radical transparency are hugely successful with it. I mean, take Whole Foods, for example, or other examples. Then you see how much potential you can unlock if you treat your employees as grown-ups, and you make them part of the journey rather than, putting them at the end of the chain in terms of sharing information.
And I think there's a fascinating example in the industry that you and I both worked in Swiss banking. So there's a thing called inside
Yes.
Paradeplatz, and Paradeplatz for people outside the industry is the sort of main square in Zurich, and the two big banks have their head offices facing off against each other across the square. And so there's this sort of web this. It's not a formal piece. It's just sort of a sort of journalist has set it up himself, and so lots of stories about the industry appear there. And I'm not saying everything they publish is true, and there have been court cases, but there is this dynamic there. And one of the things I thought was interesting, within Swiss banks, was there was a reluctance to tell staff things because it'll quote appear on Inside Paradeplatz. And I think that's an interesting example because on the one hand, you've got banking secrecy is critical, right? Customers don't want their data to be exposed publicly. And so there is a need for the basic business requires a degree of confidentiality, right? That's the nature of the relationship with customers. And so you can understand where, and of course, there's a whole history of Swiss banking secrecy and pros and cons of that we can talk about, but that's been there. But there was always this sort of invisible force there that people might go and people used to leak scurrilous stories. There's no two ways about it. There was often an agenda there, but sometimes there was useful things that were leaked that genuinely, probably were bad things that should have been exposed. And you can see in that situation that a lot of the response was, "This is difficult for us, and we're gonna react against that." And I could complete, and it was an interesting example where I can completely understand the dynamic of all of the banks saying, we don't want to be seen to be leaky things because that will ruin customer trust. On the other hand, how do we then manage that with employees? And I think that was if you like, that was a very early stage to my mind example of these challenges. If citizen journalists are going to be out there, and so one needs to think about that. And so the question then, I think, it's interesting when you talk about that transparent leadership, is there are going to be some industries where that's easier than others. If you're not going to get many banking clients if there is a perception that you are not good at protecting confidentiality. On the other hand, you've also got employees, which is a potentially different audience with different priorities, who will say, well, they're not telling us anything, right? They're keeping secrets. They're hushing things up. That's not great. And so I think that again brings us back to the subject of how do we get the right sort of leaders that can balance these things and understand that and appreciate the needs of different audiences and manage what are quite complex human dynamics.
Yeah, and I think you're absolutely right. Sharing information can never breach the confidentiality you have promised to your clients, right? So it's that is out of the question to kind of go transparent with any client data, and I was more coming from a direction of, do we make employees part of a strategic journey? Do we explain the why of decisions? Do we bring them in and ask them for their own ideas? Do we consult them when we try to find out why things are not working the way they should? Do we treat them as adults in a process like that? And I think you're absolutely right that, that blog that actually, if you will, created the situation that, if you run a town hall with some of your most senior managers, then maybe some details from that call might actually leak to that blog, and then they might write their own cynical comment about it the next day. That medium has always been negative, so there has never been any positive story in any of the
That's
with
true.
kind
That's
of
true. Yeah.
catering to how wired we are to the negative. But that's just in brackets. But I think, then a reaction, kind of the organizations I work with, kind of some CEOs reacted and saying, okay, if something leaks on the next day, um, when I try to explain my strategy, and we have an open discussion among senior people in a call, maybe with a 100 or 200 people, if that happens, then my conclusion is that I'm no longer going to speak to that group. That, of course, is emotionally understandable, but it's still the wrong conclusion because, because you cannot let your own leadership style, agenda, approach be dictated by a blogger, in Zurich. It's just, delegating responsibility for what you're doing to a third party. And of course, there might be leaks happening, but the problem cannot be approached by basically punishing an entire workforce, by treating everyone as a traitor, because there is one who actually is one, right? So I think there
Right.
have to be different approaches, and of course, but to your point, I know that there are different categories of data and information, and some categories you can talk about, and this is what I'm talking about here, right? Like we're
Hmm.
talking about, you know, how the firm is evolving, why certain strategic moves were important. That is so critical in order to keep your workforce engaged. And of course, there are then data that should not be shared, neither in writing nor verbally, with beyond a very close circle of people who are entitled to see it.
Yeah, it's interesting because it sort of points that there's a phrase needs to know.
Yeah.
And I think there are some things that not everybody needs to know, right? So personal, there are going to be things about employees that other employees don't need to know. Personal details. There are going to be things about clients that people don't need to know. But then there's a whole load of things that actually traditionally, traditional logic is we will keep this at the management level and we won't share that with employees. I think that, that's the point you're talking
Mhm.
about, right? That's where the shift
Mhm.
comes. And so we mustn't let, I would argue, if you take the banking example, you mustn't let the fact that banking confidentiality now, if client data or employee data is really important, right? No question. It's important from a legal perspective. It's important from a trust perspective as well, with the relationship you have with those people, right? That's locked
Yeah.
down, right? That shouldn't be shared. But that's not an excuse for saying we won't tell you anything about anything else, right?
Absolutely.
We've got to also have that flexible part. And so recognizing, and again, but I think humans understand that, right? You'd understand as an employee, of course, you're not going to spray client data everywhere. Of course, you're going to. I want you to keep my data about I don't know, my medical condition or my whatever it is, right? I want you to keep that private if you had that information as my employer. But there's other things where I think where it's, and so it's a case of understanding those different and navigating that, right, and not having these, which again comes back to a human approach to leadership and thinking these things through and thinking about what is it actually, well, what is it that they are going to want to know, and is it reasonable, and should we be providing it? And that requires a human touch to the leadership model.
Yeah, I agree. And I think it's probably, you can summarize it, the core skill of a positive leader. You can summarize it in sort of one word, which sounds very soft, but is very hard. And that word is care. So if a leader cares about the organization and about the people that make up the organization, they will share as much as possible about where this organization is going. They will be transparent about what they can be transparent about, and have transparency in that space that allows them to tap into the full potential kind of the people they work with. If they don't care
I
enough
love
for
that.
the rest of the organization, then they will make a step back from that obligation to inform and engage, and will say, look, I mean, this is, we cannot afford transparency because now and then there will be a leak. And I will now no longer fulfill that role, and will do what needs to be done, or what what I will inform about what I have to inform, but not beyond that. And they will kind of retreat in their fortress and only communicate with a very small circle of individuals they trust. And beyond that will no longer be visible. And we have seen it so many times. And that creates the kind of disconnection, the kind of disengagement that we have as a disease in many large organizations, and that we need to address through a different leadership approach, one that in a skillful way cares not only about the organization success, but also about the experience of employees in those organizations and make them attractive places to work.
I was going to ask you for your sort of top tip for leaders, but you've just beautifully given us that, which I think is, Siggy, is the perfect note on which to end this episode. The book is still being written, I know. And when you've got that done, we'll get you back on the show to talk us through what you've written in there. But we've had a really good, I think, sneak preview of the sorts of things that you're covering. But if people want to get hold of you in the meantime, if they're inspired by what they've heard from you, how can they find you?
Just type into your space for the URL www.talentandleadership.com. That's where you can find me. I already look forward to continuing the conversation. Also, the conversation with you, Christian. Thanks for having me and already sort of inviting me back. Once I'll have that book in my hand, I'll be more than happy to return to this podcast.
Amazing. If people's at the ready, there'll be links to that, Siggy, and other interesting things about you in the show notes that people can find there. But look, thank you so much for appearing. Well, one, I really enjoy working with you, and hopefully people will sense you're a great fun and really inspiration and got some really deep knowledge of the space. But as you've demonstrated on the show, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you. So thank you for being a great guest on the show.
Thank you for having me, Christian.
So that's it for this episode of the Human Risk Podcast. My enormous thanks to Siggy for appearing and to you for listening. To find out more about Siggy and his work on positive leadership, have a look in the show notes. There are links to those there. There are also links to other episodes of the podcast that cover leadership and leadership-related subjects, so do take a listen to those. If this is your first time listening to the Human Risk Podcast, welcome. You can subscribe wherever you get your quality audio content. It's available on all of the major podcasting platforms. Your reminder that my new book, Humanizing Rules, Bringing Behavioral Science to Ethics and Compliance, is out now. Links to that also in the show notes. I will be back very soon with another episode of this show. But in the meantime, stay positive, remember passion, purpose, and partnership. And thank you so much for listening.